Flying to Hawaii on United 747 can be a real adventure. Whatever your pleasure, you'll find it on United 747, our friendship to Hawaii.
It was 1969. Fred was living on the houseboat, working at Point Mugu, and he was going back and forth to Hawaii. Jeanne's route. Jeanne, who would go on to become Fred's first wife.
That's how we actually met, is I was coming back from Hawaii to California on a red-eye, and she was one of the flight attendants, and I noticed her right off because she was just a knockout, very beautiful woman.
She was tall and slender with dark hair. An Ally McGraw type is how she sometimes described herself. She reminded Fred of Mindy from Mork and Mindy.
And interestingly enough, halfway through, there was a guy who fell down in the aisle, and they thought there was going to be an emergency. And I remembered him as a drunk in a bar where we were getting ready to fly. And I said, I'm pretty sure that guy's just drunk. Let's check. And then Jeanne and I had our first argument because she wanted to feed him black coffee. And I said, look, do you want a sleepy, quiet guy, or do you want a wide-awake drunk? You know, this is a no-brainer. So anyhow, that was our first fuss. When we got ready to get off the plane, I said, you know, I know we didn't get off to a really great start, but could I get your name and address, and phone number? I'd like to see you, when we get back.
Jeanne had grown up Baptist on a working cattle ranch in Evergreen, Colorado, the eldest of three sisters. Describing herself later, she'd list her hobbies as piano, horseback riding, boating, and swimming. She loved the mountains and the beach. After graduating from Colorado State in 1964 with a degree in music education, Jeanne decided to become a flight attendant. When Jeanne met Fred, she was living in an apartment near LAX with her friend and fellow flight attendant, Barbara Warner. Barbara said Fred and Jeanne's relationship was bumpy from the start. Here she is, talking to an investigator.
Oh, up and down, but the smoothest real mess I've ever seen, only because of their schedules, and he was out of sea sometimes, and she was gone sometimes.
But after weathering a pregnancy scare, they decided to make it official.
I think they were both about 27 or 28 at the time. And Fred didn't think he'd ever get married. She thought, this might be my last chance. I don't think she honestly believed it because there were too many men that liked her. She really thought he was a very nice person, and he had never been married and had good background, all of those nice things. They had potential. And he wasn't dumb, and neither was Jeanne. Yeah. So they had compatible intellectual ties there, too.
Fred and Jeanne got married in 1970 at a Baptist church in Denver and had the reception at her parents' country club. They were an impressive young couple, destined for a glamorous, adventurous life. By 1974, they had two adorable little girls and had settled in Malibu, which was already, thanks to Malibu Barbie and the Chevy Malibu, becoming something more than just a semi-rural beach town at the western edge of LA. It wasn't so much a place as it was a mass projection, a collective dream. Anyone who'd known them back in Evergreen or Centerville would have thought they'd made it. They owned a Jaguar, then two. Life was good. Or at least it looked good from the outside. I'm Dana Goodyear, and this is Lost Hills. Episode 3, The Shallow End, Part 1. and Doug drowned, family friend Candy Hinman had called the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Department. She told them they really needed to look into what happened to Jeanne. She thought Fred's first marriage might shed some light on the deaths of Verna and Doug. There were tensions in Fred and Jeanne's marriage right from the beginning. Jeanne was ebullient, extroverted, and fiery. Fred was more withdrawn, controlled, exacting, a slow burn. This is Patty Lytell, a friend from Malibu. She's being interviewed by an investigator after the drownings. She's on break from her job at a bank in Santa Monica.
They had a nice home. They both had very good jobs, making good money. Seemed to be very, very well off. And they were both attractive people. Fred is an attractive person, and Jeanne was very good looking. To me, looking at them at that time, they seemed like they had everything going for them, but something was wrong.
You're talking about Jeanne?
Yeah.
Okay.
They had a nice home.
Fred and Jeanne had bought a house on a street called Calpine, in a quiet neighborhood across PCH from Point Dume.
It was so sweet that no one will ever believe me.
There was a pool.
And then later on, when we went to some friend's place and they had a hot tub, and Jeanne and I looked at each other after that evening and said, we need a hot tub. So then some other friends he was a shipbuilder. And so, long story short, he and I started building hot tubs, and the one for our house was the first one.
Fred loved it there. You could hear the distant sound of the ocean and the occasional owl.
When we first got there and Jeanne and I went to bed the first night, we went, boy, this is really dark, because there's no street lights or anything. So when you turn out the lights in your house, it's dark.
Fred remembers this as a relatively good period in the marriage.
And I think Jeanne was basically quite happy. She enjoyed the house. She enjoyed the kids. I was probably second or third. But, basically we weren't that unhappy.
They were a two-career couple trying to figure out middle-class domestic bliss when all the rules were changing. Women's lib had happened and the sexual revolution. They were supposed to be free, fulfilled, self-actualized. But they both traveled a lot for work, and they had young kids. So did they fight? Yeah, they fought.
The issues were, primarily the three big ones were sex.
He wanted more.
Finances.
She wanted more.
And, basically how to deal with the kids.
Fred was an involved father, incredibly so by the standards of the day. He worried about the potty training, what the kids ate, getting them to school on time. When Jeanne was flying, he'd pack the girls' lunches and make them dinner. Maybe it's the double standard, or maybe he was an extra amazing dad. One of his friends even said later, quote, he was a mother to those girls. In 1975, Fred was working for the Navy on Midway Atoll, way out in the Pacific, with a guy named Dennis O'Gorman. He spoke to investigators.
It was very evident that he and Jeanne weren't getting along.
O'Gorman recalled one particularly cold moment, about a month into the time on Midway. Jeanne had been writing to Fred and not hearing back. One day she called, extremely upset.
She didn't know if he was alive or dead or when he was coming home or a damn thing. The next morning, he's got this big grin on his face, and he's got this letter about this thick. And he says, that goddamn woman wants to hear from me. She'll hear from me, all right. Mm-hmm. So you open it up, and it's what they call sit reps. And all they are is they're Navy messages. And it says, recommend send money, recommend send food, recommend send, whatever. So he just packaged up all his copies that he had of these things for the last 30 days, and he wadded them up, sent them off to her. And he thought that was really funny. I thought it was kind of pathetic, So that, along with other little things he said, I began to realize that he and his first wife were not getting along very well, okay?
When Jeanne's sister Carol visited them, she found the atmosphere stifling. She thought Fred was sullen and surly, even antisocial, shut down. She hadn't seen him in 8 months, and he didn't even greet her with hello. And she was alarmed to hear the way he belittled Jeanne, addressing her as wife. Carol even asked Fred, had he forgotten her sister's name? But things for Jeanne and Fred were about to go from bad to worse, because there was a secret in their marriage, and Jeanne had started spreading it all over town. There might be at least a partial explanation for Fred's incredibly awkward behavior: deep embarrassment. Because Jeanne was pretty uninhibited when it came to expressing her discontent, and her problem with the sex wasn't his insatiable appetite.
I noticed that it was described in the report here that Jeanne called Fred the Minuteman because he couldn't last very long.
Yeah, she did.
This is Barbara Warner again, Jeanne's old roommate, speaking to the investigator. Barbara also mentioned Fred and Jeanne's tussles over finances. Jeanne was used to making her own money and spending it how she pleased.
Fred was extremely tight with his money. At least she thought so, because if she wanted something, she charged it and got it. She paid for it later. She was never late on her bills or anything, but she just went ahead and charged it. Fred thought that was insane. She ought to pay cash for everything.
At some point, Jeanne started to outright hate her husband, Fred. Talking about him, she'd shudder and say, "I can't stand him." This is Candy Hinman.
There was this part of her that when she wasn't around Fred and she wasn't thinking about Fred, that was very vibrant and very, very energetic and positive. And then she would revert into that other kind of personality. If she was around him or talking about him, then she would become intimidated.
Candy felt very strongly that Jeanne wasn't safe with Fred.
I kept telling her she needed to get out of that marriage.
In 1970, California became the country's first no-fault divorce state, and soon everyone was doing it. Within a year, for every 100 couples that got married in LA County, 79 were filing for divorce. In Malibu, there was also another factor splitting up families.
Maybe some wife swapping.
This is Michelle Williams, a friend of the Railers. And to be clear, she wanted me to know that she was not part of the swinging scene.
But there was a group who, like me, had never slept with anybody else before we got married. It was just, you just didn't do it. And so there was a little bit of a freedom for some people to, get intimate with other people. It was open marriage, and it ended in a couple of divorces.
There was this one book everyone was reading about experimenting outside marriage and how fulfilling it could be.
Carl Rogers, noted psychologist, came out with a book called Becoming Partners, where he described what open marriage would look like. And everybody was reading that book. Yeah, no, that was a pretty popular book.
Jeanne, unhappy and frustrated, had also begun to look outside her marriage for fulfillment. She told friends about a relationship she had at work with an in-flight supervisor on her Honolulu route. And then, without meaning to, she fell in love with Fred's sailing buddy, Dick Velthoen. Dick, the same person who a few years later would help return Lady the Beagle to the family after her adventure on Bird Rock. That same Dick. Jeanne and Fred spent a lot of time with Dick and his wife, Linda, as well as with another couple, Bill and Donna Fairfield. It was always the six of them, sailing together and getting naked in the hot tub. Somehow, along the way, Jeanne and Dick started to confide in each other. Here's Jeanne's friend, Barbara Warner, again.
He was disenchanted at the time, and they had been friends for a long time. Both the couples, Linda and Dick, had been friends with Jeanne and Fred. They had sailed together. And it was, one of those friendship things that had started out as a friendship, and then as she was having trouble, she would talk to Dick, and then they became more than friends.
Where would they meet at when they met?
Mostly motel.
Jeanne would check in under her own name to take advantage of her United Airlines discount. And that was not the only example of her indiscretion. This is Mike Killeen, a friend of Fred's, talking to an investigator.
Jeanne let everybody know that Fred had premature ejaculations. Isn't that embarrassing? Jeanne let everybody know that she was having affairs. My God, I knew that she was having an affair with this Dick guy. I knew that.
Unlike her fling at work, Jeanne's relationship with Dick was a serious affair. It went on for several years, and as she grew more consumed with it, she told more and more people. The more she hated Fred, the more she wanted to be with Dick. And the deeper she fell in love with Dick, the more she wanted to extricate herself from Fred. To this day, though, Fred denies that he knew about their relationship.
I'll never know about Jeanne, There was no outward signs, there was no discussions, there was no anything that would lead me to believe that.
And he insists he didn't cheat either.
And I know for myself that I didn't. I was quite happy and wanted to settle down with one person.
But one person who almost certainly did know about Jeanne's affair with Dick was Verna Johnson. Before she was Fred's second wife, Verna was one of Jeanne's best friends. She taught at the preschool at the Methodist church where Jeanne and Fred sent Heidi, and she often looked after the girls when Jeanne was flying. Jeanne and Verna were extremely tight, sharing secrets, gossip, fears. Verna knew all Jeanne's dirt. Verna's sister, Julianne, recalled spending a day at the amusement park, Magic Mountain, with Verna and Jeanne and all the kids. Julianne told an investigator that Jeanne ignored the children. She was just totally preoccupied with dishing about Fred.
She didn't say very many nice things about him. And she talked like a gossip type of talking. She would say one thing and then turn around and say, well, I told so-and-so this part. And she would talk about a lot of other people. Meaning if she was saying something to Verna, she says, well, I told so-and-so the same thing about Fred.
Verna was a confidant of Jeanne's to listen to her cry the blues about what a rat Fred was.
Candy Hinman and a lot of Jeanne's friends knew Fred kept a handgun in the house. I asked him about that. It was a .357 Smith & Wesson his parents had given him for Christmas when he was at Purdue. He kept it loaded in the drawer of his nightstand.
We were in the middle of nowhere, and it was just something that I had in case something happened.
He told me the gun was there for Jeanne's protection, as much as anything else. But the number one person Jeanne wanted protection from was Fred. Patty Lytell remembered something even more unsettling. She told detectives that Jeanne had confided in her and Verna that Fred was threatening her, saying if he ever caught her cheating, he'd kill her. There was one particularly bad night in the hot tub at Calpine that everyone remembers. It was the sextet. The Railers, the Fairfields, the Velthoans. Naked, of course. Jeanne, according to others who were there, was a little drunk or a little high, and she was getting a little loud. It was obnoxious. This was an ongoing thing. Jeanne would get carried away.
We would have wine with dinner, and when we went to parties and things, I think that's when she would get caught up in the party atmosphere and sometimes overdo it.
She was kind of a lightweight when it came to alcohol and pot.
I was bigger. I had a better way of hanging on to it and still, be able to do long division. So that was sort of the difference.
On the night in question, Jeanne dove headfirst into the hot tub where everyone else, including Dick, was already hanging out. Fred was furious. He later wrote, quote, I pulled her up by her hair and told her to get a hold of herself, unquote. When Fred's friend Mike Killeen, who wasn't there, heard about the incident, he thought it sounded overblown. His sympathies lay entirely with Fred.
Must have been a situation where Jeanne was probably mouthing off about one thing and another and embarrassing everybody, and maybe Fred did something that we all do occasionally. He overreacted.
According to Bill Fairfield's statement to detectives, everyone in the hot tub laughed about the absurdity of Fred yanking Jeanne out of the water. But this laughter probably did not include Jeanne. It became another story she confided miserably to her friends. Years later, after Verna's death, investigators interviewed Dick Velthoen about Fred and Jeanne. And Dick also took Fred's side, his sailing buddy, over his old lover. He mentioned that Fred and Jeanne fought openly in public, and that it seemed to him, Jeanne was the instigator. One day, according to a flight attendant friend of Jeanne's, she showed up at work in a state of distress.
One incident I remember distinctly, she came to work with her scarf tied up around her neck.
She had the scarf from her uniform tied around her neck and asked for permission to keep wearing it throughout the flight.
Since I was the first flight attendant in charge, she said, "You don't mind if I leave my scarf on today, do you?" I think I'd probably said, "Why?" or whatever. And she said, "Well, that bastard tried to kill me." And I said, "What?" And she said, "He tried to choke me." And I said, "Oh, you're kidding, aren't you?" And she pulled the scarf down and said, "You call that kidding?" There were marks on her neck where she said he tried to choke her.
Okay, and did he?
Just the feeling that I got from her that they, were not on the best of terms.
Now, in that choking incident,
Fred says this never happened, that he was never physical or violent with Jeanne. But Jeanne told friends she was scared of him, so scared she was going to move Fred's pistol over to Verna's house.
also, I guess things start going downhill to a point where you mentioned that Jeanne had told you several times that Fred had threatened to kill her if he ever caught her fooling around.
That's the investigator, questioning Barbara Warner.
Yeah, he did. And I never heard him say that. I only heard it through Jeanne. And, when Jeanne would say something like that to me, I would think, "Oh, he's kidding." But I think genuinely, I remember her saying, "I think he's capable of it." To be honest with you, I don't know. The only thing I can do is knowing Fred and knowing his great pride, is that his pride was hurt by possibly his influence. And her, I think as toward the end, she was getting so fed up with it. Knowing Jeanne, she probably would say, "I can't stand it another minute, get me out of here." And it probably got to him after a while. And he was outwardly, he was a very virile type macho man. And I don't think he really was. And I think Jeanne probably threw this up to him. And it was tough on him, to put it mildly.
By early summer 1976, Jeanne was growing desperate.
I know she tried to get the two of them into counseling, and he had refused to go. And then finally, after she had threatened separation and divorce, she said, "Well, okay, let's try it."
Jeanne found a therapist, and they went a couple of times. It was a failure. The best part about it, Fred says, is that he and Jeanne would get a Baskin-Robbins afterward.
And I guess it got so bad to a point that she said, no counseling in the world is going to help us. It's beyond hope.
Fred was desperate, too. The Navy was sending him back to Kauai that summer for an extended stay at the Pacific Missile Test Facility. He didn't want the marriage to end. He thought they could salvage it, but Jeanne seemed past caring. Jeanne called a lawyer to initiate the process of divorce.
She was going to tell him that he was going to be kicked out of the house when she got home. She was so sure of it by that point, by being away and thinking and trying to get her head straight. Well, she was waiting for him to get back. Evidently they had talked, and both of them knew that they had a definite problem. Jeanne was going to put her foot down and say, "I've had it. Let us try a separation."
Now, is she the kind of person that once you sat down...
When he got back from Hawaii in October, Jeanne would finally end the marriage. Barbara has speculated many times about what went on between Jeanne and Fred in that fragile moment when he returned.
You know, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell when you're put in that emotional situation what exactly she might do, but she may have been so exasperated and so tired at that point, she might have said, Fred, I'll tell you what, I have had an affair. I can't take this marriage any longer. And maybe not realizing how violent he really was.
Jeanne never did divorce Fred, because shortly after he got home, unexpectedly and inexplicably, she died. Coming up on the next episode of Lost Hills, Jeanne's funeral gets people talking.
Everything around him seemed black, dark. And his face, his look, his everything was just darkness. And I knew without a doubt that he had done it. He just looked wicked and evil. This dark face in my face. And coming over and being friendly and chatty, and I was thinking, you're a murderer. Why are you even talking to me?
That's next in Episode 4, The Shallow End, Part 2. Lost Hills is written and reported by me, Dana Goodyear. It's created by me and Ben Adair, and produced by Western Sound and Pushkin Industries. Subscribe to Pushkin Plus and you can hear the whole season ad-free and get early access to the final 2 episodes. Find Pushkin Plus on the Lost Hills show page in Apple Podcasts or at pushkin.fm.